Okay, well, it is October 28th, 2006. We're sitting here at the South Dakota School of Mines, and I'm sitting with Ted Cannon, and we're going to talk about the T28. Ted, could you just introduce yourself?
I'm Ted Cannon. I came to Colorado in 1966 from Oregon State University, where I just graduated with a PhD in physics. And I came on a postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, expecting to be there a couple of years. I had a 2-year postdoc. I ended up with NCAR for 13 years because during the postdoc period I developed a specialized film camera for taking pictures of cloud particles, also called cloud hydrometeors, from aircraft. And the first version of this camera I developed at NCAR went on a Schweitzer 232 sailplane, and we flew that aircraft in developing cumulus clouds in northeast Colorado and also in lenticular clouds on the lee of the Rocky Mountains. This camera was developed to address a serious problem that people in cloud physics research had at that time, and that was to identify the types and concentrations of particles that make up clouds. These vary in size from a few microns up to millimeter-sized particles, or even larger if you encounter hailstones. The camera which I developed was successful. It did allow us to get data that could not be obtained in any other way, especially with respect to the detail of the cloud particles. Ice particles have a lot of structure that we could identify from the photographs. Well, there was sufficient interest in this instrument that a decision was made as part of the National Hail Research Experiment to build a similar camera for the T28. And this is how I got involved with the T28 aircraft. This involvement with the T28 occurred late in the 70s while the Hail project was ongoing. I hired a person who developed photographic film transports for specialized applications, by a fellow by the name of Robert Waltz in Newport Beach, California, to develop the mechanism for this camera. And we also hired Don Kennedy with the Aeronautics and Space Division of the University of Colorado in Boulder to design a special housing for the camera that would go under the port wing of the T28. So we had over a period of I think less than a year from concept to operation, we got this camera built, and the housings built for it, and had it installed on the T28. My involvement with the T28 then was to come here to Rapid City for the installation and initial testing, which occurred over, I think, just a period of a few weeks. And then, as part of the Hail experiment, the aircraft was hangared in Laramie, and we spent some operational time there. We had some debugging to do, but it was operated out of Laramie Airport to gather data for the Hail experiment. This type of camera was pretty challenging to develop, something that would take pictures of these small particles at aircraft speed. So you have the particles going by the aircraft at over 100 miles an hour, and in size down to very small particles, microns all the way up to millimeters in size. The T28 camera is actually designed for the larger particles, say a few millimeters up to hailstone size, if those were observed by the camera. But the technical challenge was met by having high-speed strobe lights with microsecond flash duration together with a rotating mirror, which had its speed slave to the true airspeed of the aircraft. So the motion compensation was accomplished by the combination of the rotating mirror and the microsecond flash duration. The camera on the T28 consisted of two units that were mounted under the port wing. One unit contained the film transport, and the other unit provided a flat background for the photographs and had a couple of strobe lights in it. So the particles were illuminated by cross beams of high-speed light. We were able to get a number of very good ice particle images, and these data were used by the scientists working on the HALE project and correlated with data from other instruments on the aircraft as well as radar in order to get a real comprehensive picture of what is going on in the cumulus clouds in northeast Colorado, especially those leading to hailstorms. So you have this process that goes on in these clouds, which start with ascending air and condensation into droplets, and then as the cloud develops to higher altitudes and gets colder, glaciation occurs where the droplets turn into ice crystals, and these ice crystals grow at the expense of what is now super cold water droplets in the cloud to form the embryos for hailstones, and the embryos grow at the expense of the super cold cloud droplets into large enough particles, and especially if there's a strong updraft, these can become hailstones of considerable size. So it's this process that we were using the T28 and radars to study. So that was really my contribution with this one instrument. There were other instruments used to measure the size of cloud particles. The South Dakota School of Mines had a hail shadowing instrument. As hailstones or larger hydrometeors would pass through, then a record of the shadow is recorded by the electronics. And then Robert Nollenberg developed some, in fact, he made a business of developing a number of instruments for this purpose. These were shadowing and scattering instruments. And the advantage of his instruments over the camera was that it gave a lot of data in a relatively small time, and it could be analyzed with a computer. So those instruments were on the T28 as well as my camera. So I worked one summer out of Laramie working with that went on for several weeks, working with the T28. Time.
So you were at, for one summer of the field work?
Yeah.
Can you just kind of describe for us who weren't there what that was like? Where did you stay? What did you do? What was your daily routine? What did you do for fun? What did you do when you weren't?
Yeah, I got a motel in Laramie and stayed there. And we had this regular routine of going out to the Laramie airport every morning. And Jim Weber was a technician who worked with me, and he was responsible for some other instruments on the T28 as well, but he and I worked together to unload the film from the previous day and then load a new roll of film into the camera for the day's data taking. Uh, and once we had everything, the camera part was done, well, I didn't have a lot to do. But there was a waiting period, waiting for cumulus clouds to develop over northeast Colorado. And I guess when we got a call from, probably came from the Grover site where the radars were, that's where the project was coordinated from Grover. When we got the okay, then Wayne would take off with the T28 to get the data. As far as recreation, I was just thinking on the way down the other night, it was evening and I was driving, or way up, I was driving from Golden and kind of hungry, and I got to thinking about Jim Weber and his crock pot. One of my great recollections of this summer was going over to Jim Weber's apartment and having supper with him. He would leave a crock pot going during the day and produce some really great meals. So that was about the most recreational thing I did. There's not a lot to do in Laramie, especially for a conservative guy like me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I could, I'm getting back to technical again.
Sure.
But processing all of this film was quite a challenge, and we did have a darkroom set up at Grover. So I would take the film back to Grover. I don't know if you know where Grover, Colorado is. It's a very small town in northeast Colorado, and we operated out of there. And I would take the film back there and process it and then analyze it. And I had to do all the analysis by hand using a microscope. I had tried to scan the negatives using electronic means, but at that time electronic instrumentation for digitizing film was very slow, and I tried this with a very sophisticated instrument, University of Colorado in Boulder. It took overnight to analyze one frame of film.
So you would scan the film, or you would make a print, or how did that
It would
work?
automatically scan the negative and digitize it, and then you could analyze the digital information with the computer. But the technology had not advanced to the point where you could do it with thousands of photographs, such as we were getting with the T28. So it was I remember spending many especially after hours in a trailer in Grover, manually looking at these images and writing down the data by hand. I've often thought how much fun it would be to start the project all over again today with our modern digital cameras and digital, computerized image analysis. Give us the data much more rapidly than it would then.
So the holdup in the digital processing was the computer? The scanning was fine, but the computer just couldn't keep up with that many images?
It was actually the scanning process was very slow at that time. They had one of these scanners at the observatory in Gates Observatory at the University of Colorado. I think it's the Gates Observatory. Anyway, for analyzing astronomical images, that's how I happened to stumble onto it. But the process was just too slow at that time.
So you said you came up with thousands of photographs.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this camera, exactly how it worked. It would take flash photographs.
Yeah.
And then it would advance the film. What kind of film was this that it was using? Was this standard commercial film, or was it specialized large format film?
No,
or?
it was 35 millimeter film. But it came on long rolls. I think there were 3,400 images on a roll. And I've forgotten the film type, but it was a commercial type film made by Kodak. It
Black
was
and white.
Black and white, of course, yeah, exactly.
So this camera, as you describe it, one half of it is basically the backdrop with the lighting, and the other half was the actual camera.
Correct.
And they were in sync, obviously, so
Yeah.
the flash would go off as it
Yeah.
would take a
Yeah.
picture. How often would it take a picture then?
Oh, it would take several pictures a second. I've forgotten the exact frame rate at this time. It's like click, 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 something like that. And it took some time, it took a time for the capacitors to recharge on the flash units. I suppose that was the main limiting factor in how fast we could take the pictures. And of course, all this had to be synchronized to the airspeed. The rotating mirror had to be synchronized with the film transport and with the flash. So there was a lot of logic in this. There was a lot of logic developed by Waltz and company to make this work. It was hardened logic. Motorola, we didn't have the specialized chips that we had today, but Motorola had a line of hardened electronics components that we put into this. And by hardened, that means that they were not susceptible to static electricity or variations in voltage, things like that some of the less expensive components were. So this was the best technical solution that Waltz could come up for developing this logic.
Now, the rotating mirror was in the camera portion. Was
Yeah.
that with the lens? The rotating mirror was so that you would get essentially a still photograph of hailstones or whatever, little meteors
Yeah.
in place. Now, was that on the lens, or how did that work? How
Well-
exactly did this rotating mirror?
If you go from it, let's say we're traveling from outside the camera through to the film plane, I'll explain what you encounter, what the light beam encounters. Well, first of all, we start out here in the focal area. There's an area where the lens of the camera is focused. That's where the particles in the beams cross in the area where the camera is focused, and the light then is scattered off the particles. First, it goes through a heated window. We had to have a window so the moisture didn't get inside the camera. So you have a heated window, followed by the lens, and then a rotating mirror, which turns the light at 90 degrees into the camera, film transport, specialized film transport. So it's heated mirror, rotating mirror, heated mirror, lens, rotating mirror, film transport. That's the path that the light from the particles took.
So, did this mirror function like the shutter?
Yeah,
This mirror essentially was the shutter,
yeah.
and it was just a flat mirror, and it would.
Just a flat front surface mirror, it's called. That is, the silver was on the outside. Most of the mirrors, the cosmetic type mirrors, the silver is protected by a layer of glass, but in this case, it was a front surface mirror. The light was actually scattering right off of the silver.
And the film, would it move at a constant rate, or would it advance and stop, advance and stop?
It's stop, advance, stop, yeah.
This is a tricky thing.
Yeah. It was a prototype. I mean, it was the first of its kind, and we did have some birthing problems with it. One of the things I remember was that when I first got it, there were several things that didn't work as they were supposed to. And I remember taking it to Southern California as baggage. I took this expensive camera as baggage because we were in a hurry to get it fixed, so I didn't want to ship it, and I just took it as baggage down to Newport Beach to Waltz and spent a very long day with him debugging it. And this was before we even put it on the T28. We had to make it sure it worked correctly in the laboratory.
This is carry-on luggage?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, Waltz is his name?
Woltz.
Waltz.
Yeah, Robert Waltz. It's company was Robert Waltz Associates.
He actually built it.
Yeah. I don't know what's happened to him. I'm not sure if he's still living.
You designed it, and Robert Waltz and Associates built it.
Well, I did the conceptual design, but he did the detailed design and put it together and got it working.
And did he work in these kind of cameras, or was he a general camera maker, or?
He was a specialist in film transport, specialized film transports. I remember at the time I went out there, he had been working on surveillance cameras for the border between Mexico and the United States. They had some specialized, I think they were infrared cameras for observing the borders, and this was not a camera that was available on the market, so he developed it. And I think he did some work for Hollywood on specialized cameras. So,
Yeah, I'd be surprised if he never had any conversations with the CIA or someone like that.
yeah, I bet he did.
I bet he did too.
Yeah, yeah.
So, can you tell me a little bit more about the data analysis? You would make prints from these negatives.
Only to show people. The analysis was actually done from the negatives. I didn't have to make prints, so I'd take the original negatives and I had a special setup on a microscope so I could look at them one at a time.
So you just looked that directly at the negatives. You didn't
Yeah.
even blow up the negatives on the
No.
screen or anything.
No.
And so you would have to, would you quantify what you saw in each scene, or were you just, what was your sort of mental process as you're looking at all these negatives under the microscope?
Well, it involves several steps. Let's say, probably the first thing I would look for was whether there were water drops in the image. And because of the cross beams, okay, you have two light sources here, and these beams are crossing in the plane of focus of the camera. A water drop would appear as two dots. You could see a little bit of perimeter, but it would appear as two dots because the water drop would act like a lens and it would form images of the two light sources, and those little two dot images were what the film recorded. If the image drop were very far from the plane of focus, then you would get overlapping discs. And then as it got further and further out of focus, these would get larger and eventually disappear if the particle was too close or too far away from the heated window. So I would say the first step in the process was to identify if there were water drops or not. This was important to scientists working on the hail problem, because one of the issues they had was whether there were significant zones of large supercooled drops. By supercooled, I mean those the temperature of the drops in the environment is below 40 degrees, which minus 40, which is the same Fahrenheit centigrade. They cross over at that point. So if the temperature is below minus 40, then the drops are supercooled, and they don't necessarily freeze, even though they're below freezing temperature. So people were interested in knowing if there were large zones of these supercooled drops. If there were, then the hailstones would grow very rapidly on these large supercooled drops, because as soon as the drop contacted the stone, it would freeze, and you'd get rapid accretion, and the stone would grow very rapidly, fall out. So that's why it was important to make the ice-hail distinction. And then if it was ice can occur in a number of different forms, from the pristine Christmas card shape that many people associate with snow. But
Are you telling me you saw pretty little crystals on these pictures?
Yeah.
You did?
Did I what?
Did you see pretty little crystals
Oh,
on these
pretty.
pictures? Is that what you're talking about when you talk about the
Not
Christmas
very-
card?
Not so many in northeast Colorado. We did over the, when we worked winter wave clouds, we saw a lot of those crystals in winter wave clouds, but not so many if any, in northeast Colorado. What we would see in northeast Colorado were fragments of these. You'd see pieces that started out pristine or fairly pristine, but then they would break, and you'd get these splinters and slivers of ice. And then these would grow with, they would accrete the supercooled droplets. And so you'd see little slivers with accumulations of translucent ice on them. You'd see grapple particles. Those are the particles on which the hailstones grow. They're called grapple. You may be familiar with that terminology, but those would grow at the expense of the supercooled droplets in the cloud, and we did see quite a few grapple particles. So I would write down then what the particles are frame by frame. The individual frames were correlated in time with the data from the other instruments during the flight and with the radar reflectivity data, so that we would have that information. And then I'd also make an estimate of the concentration, the number of particles per unit volume, so we had an idea of the concentration at that particular point in the flight.
So you were basically keeping a written log as you looked at
Yeah.
frame by frame by frame? And
Yeah.
you'd write down,
Yeah.
it sounded like several different numbers, you'd quantify it?
Yeah, I had whether it was ice or water, an estimate, a measurement. I could actually measure with a scale what the size was, whether it was within the zone of focus of the camera, and then from that estimate the concentration, number per cubic meter or liter.
And how long would it take you to do one frame?
Well, it depended on how many images were in each frame. I could maybe spend 10 minutes on a frame. When you have several thousand of these to do, I spent many hours at it. And I did have a student assistant too who helped me with that.
I can see why you tried the computer first.
Yeah, exactly. These days it could probably be done automatically, overnight.
So are these photos still around, these negatives?
Uh,
I'd be curious to
I-
see one of these.
Yeah, what I'd like to do is send you some prints. I do have a nice set of prints of some of the better images
That'd be fantastic.
that
I'd
I
love
show
to see
people.
those.
Yeah,
Uh,
I can do that.
I would appreciate that.
Sure.
I'm trying to think, how much space are we talking about here that you're looking at? I mean, this camera would measure, how big of an area wide and deep and tall?
Yeah, it was, and I can't quote exact figures anymore.
Sure.
This is too long ago, but I think the in-focus volume was, it was several centimeters on a side by, and then the depth depended on the size of the particle. So,
How far apart were the actual camera and the screen, the two halves of this camera?
let's
Few-
see, the camera and the background were maybe 4 feet apart,
Oh, I
something
see.
like that. Yeah, there was a fairly good gap.
But most of that area wouldn't show particles because they wouldn't be in focus.
Not only wouldn't be in focus, but also they'd be outside the cross beams.
I see.
So, there's a cone here between the heated mirror and the focal plane that is dark because the beams are crossing here, okay?
Mhm.
And then there's a cone that's dark back here next to the flash unit. So that helped define the in-focus volume.
Sounds to me as if you did all the work on this project.
Well, I had the concept.
Right?
The concept was mine to do the original sailplane version, and people liked that. And I could tell you about that camera too, but that's beside the point. But we had proven it conceptually that we could take pictures of cloud hydrometeors from aircraft we approved it conceptually, and that allowed us to go ahead and do one for the T28.
Now, just a practical question, did the pilot turn this camera off and on?
Yeah,
So, because otherwise it would waste far too much film
Oh,
if you just
yeah.
left it running.
yes.
So someone would tell him, okay, now we're in the zone, start taking pictures. Or he just
I
he just
think
knew
pretty,
that.
you can ask Wayne, but I think
Yeah.
he pretty much made that decision himself. I don't think it was made from the ground. You know, they were tracking his flight path from Grover, and they knew where, in fact, that was a safety issue, which Wayne will talk more about, but there was a certain radar reflectivity above which he was not to fly in that high reflectivity. But okay, they were tracking him, but I think the decision to turn the camera on was probably made by Wayne himself, based on what he was observing.
And so this camera might run for, I mean, the total flight was only something like an hour and a half. So
Yeah.
how long could this camera run continuously?
Well, maybe half an hour before it would run out of film.
This is a lot of images that you had.
Yeah.
Did you store it? Do you still have all these negatives somewhere?
I'm not sure that data is still around. I don't know what became of it.
This would be a pretty sizable closet full of rolls of
It could even
film.
be in my basement. I've got so much stuff in my basement that it could even still be there. I wouldn't know it.
Well, so can you I'm not a scientist. Someone's going to ask me what the overall scientific impact of all of this was. Where does this fit into the science? What contribution did this make to the science?
I think you're bordering on some politics here, which I'm not sure if I want to address. I'm sure I don't know if you've gotten into the history of the HAIL program yet, or some of the politics involved there.
Go ahead and tell me.
Well, okay. I'll tell you what I know of it, but there are other people who are more qualified to do so than I am. But around the mid-'70s, there was information coming out of Russia that the Russians had been pretty successful at hail suppression using seeding techniques. And Doyne Sarter from NCAR and someone else, I've forgotten his name, went over to Russia and attempted to get some information on this. And I guess they came back with a report that they were indeed making progress in this area, but they weren't able to get a lot of definitive information from the Russians due to their political system. They couldn't get into as much detail as they had hoped, but hail is a serious problem in this country. It's taken very seriously, of course, by the people here at the School of Mines, and the question was, can we use seeding to suppress hail, crop-damaging hail? So the National Hail Research Experiment was funded by our government to determine how the efficacy, that's the terminology they like to use, the efficacy of cloud seeding to suppress hail. And after working on approximately 5 years, I guess the conclusion of the hail experiment was, if anything, we have made more hail than we've suppressed, but statistically, it really doesn't mean that much. Let's say it wasn't an overwhelming indication that cloud seeding was really doing the job it was hoped for. So, I guess I don't want to take it any further than that. You can talk to other people who are really qualified and were on the front lines of this project. To me, what what really did come out of it that is meaningful for cloud science and weather studies is some very good papers on what they call supercells. These are papers that were written by some folks at NCAR based on all of this data these data that were gathered that describe the development and processes that go on in cumulus clouds, convective clouds in northeast Colorado and elsewhere. You know, using all this data, this was wonderful data. This was data that really hadn't been obtained previously. You had this great collection of data from radars and from particle measuring instruments and temperature measuring equipment, even hail collectors on the ground. So you put all this together, and these scientists were able to come up with some really good comprehensive papers that describe how these convective cells develop and how the precipitation develops within them. So this is fundamental cloud science,
Mm-hmm.
and this will be of use to people in the future.
So in this whole array of these data sources, how significant was the T28 and what was that significance?
Well, it was very significant because it was actually in the cloud, and it was measuring these parameters in situ. We use the term in situ to mean as they are naturally in the cloud, undisturbed by the presence, relatively undisturbed by the presence of an instrument or, there's some exhaust pollution. It's not a perfect process, but the fact that it's getting in situ data on cloud temperature, liquid water, hydrometeors, all these things that are going on in the cloud, this is priceless data.
And it sounds as if this hail camera, to call it that, was right at the heart of this whole question.
Yeah. The camera that I developed, the South Dakota School of Mines hail imaging instrument, these Nolenberg probes I was talking to you about, these are all used to measure the hydrometeors in the clouds. And that's a difficult thing to do. And this was a very, very unique situation, and the T28 contributed very significantly to atmospheric science and cloud physics, to its participation in this program.
So it sounds as if you consider this a success. It sounds as if you have positive memories of the T28 and your association with it. Is that accurate to say?
Oh yeah, sure.
It met your expectations?
It did, yeah. It did. I only contributed a small part to it, but I was glad to be able to do that. It was a technical challenge, and it was a fun project for me. All my life I've enjoyed working with instrumentation and doing this sort of thing, and I was very fortunate to have this job. Started out at NCAR expecting to be there 2 years, and thanks to the sailplane and the T28, I was there 13. The HALE project was defunded in about '79, and I quickly found another job at Solar Energy Research Institute, working with optics and instrumentation.
Well, Ted, we'll have to sit down and talk about that some other day.
Sure.
That sounds like a whole other story.
Yeah, I won't get started on that. But
Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome,
I
Rob.
appreciate talking.
I enjoyed doing it.
Thanks a lot.
You bet.
Okay, Ted, so you're going to tell me how you got hired
Yeah,
or why you got hired by
we were
NCAR.
just, Rob and I were just talking about my education and how I came to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. I'll say just a little about that. I graduated with a PhD in nuclear physics from Oregon State in 1966. I knew some people in the atmospheric science department at Oregon State. I never took a course in that department, but I knew some people in that department. And one time one of these gentlemen approached me and he, Ted, what are you going to do after you get your degree. Well, I wasn't married. I was free to essentially do anything. So I said, well, I'm still looking around. I do have a promise of a teaching job in Santa Barbara. Well, you should look into going to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. They're just building a new laboratory there, and I've got some connections, so I think you ought to go out there and interview. So in the spring of 1966, I went out, and they took me up to this beautiful building on a mesa just south of Boulder, where they were building this new laboratory. It's a very impressive building. They were still constructing it. My interviewer, Doyne Sarter, took me up to the 5th floor. This wonderful office with a picture window looking at Bear Creek Canyon, a little door that went out to a balcony, a waterfall underneath that I could listen to, and this is your office if you will come to NCAR. So I figured, well, God's leading me here. And so I took the position and went there in the fall, even before the building was finished.
Huh.
But just working in that building was a wonderful experience in itself. The reason that they hired a nuclear physicist was, at the time, the philosophy of NCAR management was we need to hire people from areas outside of atmospheric science, because we have a lot of unsolved problems in atmospheric science, and we think that chemists and biologists and physicists, even nuclear physicists, can contribute to atmospheric science. So hopefully they were right when they hired me.
Yeah, we hope. Now, Grace, you had a technical instrumentation story.
Come over here.
Yeah, you come on over here.
Tell us a little-
Here, well, hold on, I'll
sit
zoom
down
out a little
here,
bit.
dear.
Just that he used his personal camera to do some of this photography, and when we went and bought our engagement ring, he took pictures of everything. The salesman, the clerks, the place. Got home and took some more pictures of my roommate and I, and then sits on the couch and he gets this kind of sad look. And he says, "Oh no, this is microfilm." And I said, "Well, we can look at them anyway." And he says, "No, they were set for color film." So we don't have any picture. We had to go back and we took one picture of the salesman and us.
Did we develop the microfilm?
I never saw it.
Oh, I must have developed it. That would
You
be a
said
scientific
it was
instrument.
ruined.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, I'm glad you had more success on the T28 getting the grapple.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I
Yeah.
got better grapple pictures than I did of the engagement ring of my wife.
And the marriage survived that, so.
36 years.
All's well
36
that
years,
ends well.
yeah. It's been a great life.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much.
Oh, sure.